tonight we step quietly into a land that no longer remembers its own breath. The moon hangs low over Anatolia, silvering the cracked stone of a ruin half swallowed by time. The air hums with cicadas and the faint, sweet musk of something long fermenting in the soil. You crouch beside a shard of pottery, press your fingertips into its grain, and feel warmth, yes, warmth, rising from clay that hasn't been touched in 3,000 years. You probably won't survive this kind of curiosity, but at least you'll go down with a good story and maybe a faint whiff of ancient beer on your sleeve. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through corridors carved from basalt and limestone, the echo of your steps bouncing between collapsed pillars that once guarded the heart of the Hittite Empire. Somewhere beneath your soles, sealed vessels sleep, filled with the ghosts of forgotten fermentation, grains, fruits, and milk that once bubbled and breathed under a sun older than Rome. You pass your flashlight beam over a relief of a bull-headed god, its face chipped, yet its grin still smug, as if it knows you're trespassing on one of history's tastiest secrets. Historians still argue whether the Hittites were true innovators in fermentation or simply magpies stealing techniques from neighbors like the Hurrians and Babylonians. What's certain is this: they mastered the art of letting time do the cooking. In a world without thermometers or yeast packets, they learned to read the land, smelling the wind, watching the rise of bubbles in clay, and trusting intuition far more than instruction. You imagine the first moment it happened, a forgotten bowl of barley mash left too long in the corner of a hut. Days later, the smell turns sour, but someone, perhaps too hungry, perhaps too brave, dips a finger in. The taste is sharp, intoxicating, alive. A mistake becomes a miracle, and the Hittite world quietly learns that food can rot its way into divinity. Clay jars become sacred. Not the kind of sacred that ends up on a museum shelf, but the kind that once glowed near a hearth, marked with fingerprints of hands that believed the gods lived inside their food. Some jars were wrapped in leather to keep them warm, others buried in cool earth to slow the bubbling rage of grain transforming into liquid life. The Hittites didn't yet have words for microbes, but they had plenty for magic. They called it the breath of the earth. As you explore, the air shifts, warm, moist, and rich with the earthy sweetness of malt. You've stumbled into what might have been a brewery, or maybe a temple kitchen. It's often hard to tell the difference in Hittite culture. Brewing wasn't just about drinking, it was a prayer, a performance. Clay tablets from Hattusa mention offerings of bapir, a sort of baked barley bread soaked and re-fermented into beer for gods and kings alike. One mainstream fact: archaeologists have indeed found traces of fermented barley beverages in Bronze Age Anatolia, evidence that the Hittites were well acquainted with brewing. They might not have written down the exact recipe, but their neighbors, the Sumerians, did, and the similarities are uncanny. Picture a Hittite priestess humming while stirring a pot with a carved wooden paddle, her hands moving in rhythm to words older than her own bones. Then there's the quirky tidbit: some Hittite brewers may have intentionally added a pinch of soil or even a smudge of clay from a temple floor to feed their brews. Sounds unhygienic, sure, but that's soil teemed with wild yeast, what modern brewers now pay premium prices to cultivate. Imagine the irony: ancient dirt as artisanal starter culture. You move your flashlight across a stone basin and see residue like fine dust. Maybe it's barley ash. Maybe it's history's equivalent of beer foam. You lift the lid of a half-buried jar, and for a second, you could swear the air itself exhales. Warm, sour, a bit like bread and thunder mixed together. The same smell that might have filled these rooms when the Hittite Empire was still teaching its children how to pray and drink in the same breath. There's a kind of serenity in imagining them here. A brewer, wiping sweat from their brow, muttering that the mash listens better when the moon is new. someone else scolding them for letting it sit too long. You almost expect to find their fingerprints still pressed into the glaze. Yet beneath the all, there's melancholy. The Hittites left behind thousands of tablets about treaties and taxes, but barely a word on how they turned grain to gold. Their fermentation methods survive only in the chemical traces found by modern archaeologists scraping residue from jars. So you piece it together with imagination, guided by what remains: a whisper in clay, a stain in a pot, a god carved with a goblet in hand. You step outside again. The night has deepened. Stars flicker above, ancient and unblinking, the same ones the Hittite brewers watched as they prayed for their next batch not to explode or taste like mud. The wind hums through the ruins, low and constant, a lullaby from another millennium. Somewhere, a thought stirs. Maybe the Hittites didn't think of fermentation as chemistry at all. Maybe they thought of it as negotiation, with time, with decay, with the invisible. Each jar a treaty, each bubble a clause. You breathe in the silence and swear you can still hear the soft fizz of a world quietly transforming itself from one state to another. You kneel, press your hand to the ground, and feel the faint vibration of history still at work beneath your palm. The earth itself ferments, slowly turning stone into dust, dust into life, and life into story. You smile, because maybe, just maybe, the Hittites understood that better than anyone. You trudge further into the ruins, the air thick with dust and a faint sweetness that could almost be bread left too long on a windowsill. The stones under your feet still hold the memory of heat, old hearths where barley once bubbled, foamed, and hissed like a restless creature trying to escape its pot. The Hittites didn't just drink beer, they revered it. Their gods had favorite brews, their priests guarded recipes like royal secrets, and their workers, after long days hauling stones for temples, probably prayed harder for a jug than for redemption. You pause beside a cluster of clay vats sunk halfway into the ground. Their rims are crusted with a dark residue, and you can almost hear a faint fizzing, like carbon dioxide sighing from the ghost of a ferment long gone. The Hittites called their brew karas, or so some scholars translate the word from surviving tablets. Others claim the term meant something broader, any sacred mixture of grain and water. Historians still argue whether karas referred to the drink itself, the container, or both. Either way, you can imagine someone lifting one of these pots with reverence, the surface still warm, the air alive with the smell of cooked cereal and yeast. A mainstream fact grounds the scene. Archaeological digs at Hattusa and Alacahoyuk have unearthed grain processing areas that seem purpose-built for brewing. Barley husks, charred mash, and clay strainers suggest that the Hittites made a beer thick enough to eat with a spoon. Not quite the fizzy pint you're used to, more like liquid bread, filling, sour, and possibly strong enough to make diplomacy seem like a good idea. You crouch and imagine the process. First came the malting. Barley soaked in water until it sprouted, then dried on woven mats under the Anatolian sun. The grains were crushed with stone rollers, probably the same ones used for grinding flour, though you suspect the brewers fought the bakers for time on them. The crushed malt was mixed with warm water in large earthen pots, forming a sweet porridge. Then came the mystery, the waiting. No one yet knew why some mixtures frothed and others didn't. So they blamed the gods, or the moon, or perhaps the mood of whoever stirred the pot. A breeze brushes past, carrying the faintest trace of yeast and soil. You grin. It smells a bit like a modern brewery, only dustier and without the awkward indie music. The Hittites didn't filter their beer, so the final product was cloudy, hearty, and probably chewy enough to qualify as a meal. Some records even suggest that straws made of reed were used to drink it, allowing people to sip beneath the thick foam and avoid the gritty layer of mash at the bottom. It's oddly elegant, like sipping soup with style. You brush dust from a nearby wall carving and find a faint depiction, a seated figure holding a cup, another pouring from a large jug. The lines are crude, but the message is clear: communal drinking. Beer wasn't just refreshment, it was ceremony, social glue. A family might share a single vat during a festival, dipping their straws in turn while reciting blessings. You can almost hear the laughter, the rhythmic drum beats, the clash of bronze cups. Then, a quirky tidbit. The Hittites sometimes flavored their brews with herbs and even crushed juniper berries. Not for taste, mind you, at least not entirely. Some scholars believe these additives were divine perfumes meant to please the gods who drank through scent rather than sip. Imagine praying through your nose. Suddenly incense makes a lot more sense. You trace your finger around the lip of a cracked pot. It's rough, uneven, still gritty. The thought strikes you. Someone once poured boiling mash into this with bare hands, probably humming to distract from the heat. Brewing was domestic labor, often women's work, though in temples, men took over the ritual aspect. In private homes, it was survival. In sanctuaries, it was cosmic theater. Every bubble in the pot symbolized life renewing itself, even as grain died in the process. You can almost feel the rhythm of their lives around you. Early morning barley grinding, water fetched from wells, smoke stinging eyes, laughter around simmering pots. Maybe a child sneaks a sip too early, makes a face, and gets scolded. Maybe someone accidentally overcooks the mash, and the whole house smells like burnt oatmeal for a week. They had no temperature gauges, no stainless steel fermenters, just intuition and the kind of patience you only get when you have no Wi-Fi. Still, their skill was real. They learned that fermenting at night gave smoother flavor. Cooler air slowed the souring, making the brew less aggressive. You imagine a Hittite brewer standing under the stars, hand over the lid, murmuring thanks to Tahut, the storm god, for not ruining the batch. The night hums with insects, the scent of barley drifts upward, and the clay pot seemed to breathe along with the earth. And here's a small debate that keeps historians awake. Was Hittite beer intentionally alcoholic, or did it only reach mild fermentation? Some argue the heat and thick texture meant it stayed low in alcohol, more nourishing than intoxicating. Others point to drinking feasts described in royal texts that sound suspiciously rowdy. The truth might be both. They probably had everything from mild breakfast beer to the kind of stuff that makes you think you can talk to statues. You straighten up, the beam of your flashlight catching a faint sparkle, mica dust in the clay, shimmering like fireflies. You realize how intimately this process connected people to their environment. Every ingredient was local. Barley from the plains, water from nearby springs, yeast drifting invisibly through the air. Even the vessels carried fingerprints of the soil they were made from. To drink Hittite beer was, quite literally, to consume the land. And maybe that's why it mattered so much. When war or drought came, brewing continued, not as indulgence, but as ritual resilience. Fermentation was control amid chaos, time you could taste, proof that even decay could nourish. You picture them raising cups in dim lamplight, toasting survival, gods, and maybe just another day without collapse. You step back from the vats, the smell of dust and ancient malt still clinging to your nostrils. A faint tremor of wind whistles through the hollow pots, sounding eerily like a breath. You smile at the thought that perhaps, even now, the air remembers what it was to ferment, to bubble, to change, to live. You wander deeper into the heart of what once was Hattusa, the ancient capital, following the faint scent of something floral and fermented. The trail leads you past the remnants of stone storage pits, into a smaller chamber half collapsed and perfumed with honey dust and broken pottery. Your flashlight glides across the floor, catching the amber glint of crystallized residue, thick, viscous, stubbornly clinging to a corner like a memory that refuses to dissolve. Honey. The Hittites adored it, not just for sweetness but for its alchemy. They called it the food of the gods, and, in a way, they weren't wrong. Honey was eternal, It never spoiled, only darkened and deepened with time. And when mixed with water and left to the mercy of wild yeast, it became something miraculous. You're staring at the remnants of what was once a Hittite mead hall, a place where honey met the divine in bubbling silence. A mainstream historical fact buzzes to mind. Mead predates beer and wine in many ancient cultures, and Anatolia was no exception. Hittite texts mention honey offerings to their storm god, Tahut, and his consort Araniti, the sun goddess. They believed these deities fed on the vapors of fermenting honey, sweet mist rising from clay bowls placed on altars during sacred feasts. You imagine the air heavy with that aroma, honey, heat, and the faint sting of alcohol, curling upward like invisible incense. You kneel beside a cracked jar, run your thumb across its rim, and taste dust mixed with sweetness. It's faint, but it's there, the ghost of fermentation. You can almost hear the sticky laughter of attendants preparing offerings, voices bouncing off the temple walls. In your mind, you see a priest dipping his fingers into a golden mixture, letting it drip slowly onto a slab of basalt, each drop a prayer for rain. The process was simple but precise. They'd dilute honey with river water, perhaps flavour it with dried herbs or bits of fruit. Then, they'd seal the mixture in a pot, trusting the Anatolian air to summon the invisible yeast that floated everywhere, on their hands, on the reeds, even on the bees themselves. Weeks later, the mixture would froth, hiss, and change color. When it cleared, it was ready, mead, the drink of gods and lunatics alike. Historians still argue whether the Hittites drank this mead as part of everyday life or reserved it for the elite. Some suggest it was strictly ceremonial, an offering never meant for mortal lips. Others propose that everyone, peasants included, tasted a diluted version during harvest festivals. Maybe that's true. Maybe a shepherd, far from the city, once found a jar left too long in the shade, sipped it, and laughed at the gods' generosity. After all, divine accidents were the Hittites' favorite kind. You brush away a cobweb and find another jar, smaller and decorated with faint spiral motifs. A quirky tidbit: some Hittite artisans embedded actual bee wings into glaze before firing the pottery, believing it would entice sweetness from whatever it held. The result? Pots with faint, ghostly impressions of wings, as though bees themselves had signed off on the recipe. You can't help but grin. Branding, Bronze Age edition. You lift the lid, expecting nothing, but a faint puff of air escapes, a dry whisper that smells faintly like caramel and sunburnt wood. For a moment, you think you hear the low thrum of distant thunder, and it clicks. Tahut, the storm god, wasn't just about weather. He was the patron of fermentation, lightning as the spark of life, rain as the gift that made yeast bloom. To drink honey wine was to drink his energy, liquid thunder sealed in clay. You can picture it vividly now, a ritual banquet deep within the citadel. Golden goblets glint in lamplight, the mead within them reflecting fire like molten amber. Priests chant invocations while servants move in careful choreography, pouring offerings into basins. The walls hum with cymbals and slow drums, the rhythm echoing a heartbeat. Then, the first sip, soft, floral, intoxicating enough to make the air shimmer. A collective sigh follows, half reverence, half relief. You take a deep breath and swear the air around you thickens. Maybe it's imagination, maybe the ghosts of volatile compounds still lingering after all these centuries. You can almost taste it on your tongue, a tang of fermentation and time. Mead has that peculiar gift. It carries the scent of the world's first sweetness, trapped and transformed. One tablet fragment found near this site mentions the honey that breathes. Scholars think it refers to mead fermenting, bubbles rising to the surface as though the drink itself were alive. You find that image oddly soothing. Something once inert becoming animated, something once forgotten now exhaling faintly through centuries of dust. You walk toward the doorway, brushing your fingers along the wall. The texture is gritty, but here and there you find streaks of dark, sticky residue, old honey that seeped into the cracks. You imagine the chaos of a spill during a festival, servants scrambling, bees swarming the temple. You chuckle quietly. Bees have no respect for divinity. Outside, the night air cools your skin. You look up at the stars and imagine them as pinholes leaking honey-colored light, feeding the sleeping earth below. You wonder how much of this the Hittites understood, fermentation as both science and symbol. They didn't see yeast as microbes but as spirits of transformation, divine messengers that whispered through jars and pots. To them, the bubbling of honey wine wasn't chemistry, it was worship. And you, standing here with your modern flashlight and half-dry throat, feel oddly humbled. You realize that every time you open a bottle of kombucha or pour a craft beer, you're repeating their ritual in miniature. The same alchemy, the same waiting, the same invisible hands at work. The only difference is that you have labels and disclaimers. They had faith. You close your eyes and listen. The wind shifts through the ruins, and for a heartbeat, it sounds like bees. The low hum circles your ears, distant yet comforting. Maybe they are still here, the bees, the brews, the gods who drank thunder from honey jars. Maybe the air remembers more than we do. You follow the lingering sweetness of the honey halls until it fades into something sharper, tangy, earthy, unmistakably alive. The ground under your sandals turns to packed clay, and the walls narrow into what feels like a forgotten corner of a palace kitchen. The air is cooler here, heavy with the ghost of milk turned to something more interesting. You catch the faint scent of sourness, cheese, perhaps, or yogurt. The Hittites, you realize, didn't just ferment grain and honey. They coaxed milk into strange, noble shapes too. You kneel near a stone trough still stained white. There's a thin crust around its edge, brittle as bone. You brush it with a fingertip and watch it crumble into powder. Milkstone, calcium residue. Proof that this space once pulsed with life, with animal breath and the soft slosh of liquid being poured from one vessel to another. A forgotten dairy, tucked beneath the grandeur of temples. And, as you're about to find out, one that might have produced both breakfast and beauty treatments. A mainstream historical fact first. The Hittites raised cattle, sheep, and goats, and kept detailed records of livestock rations for palace and temple use. Their economy revolved partly around dairy, especially ghee and curds. Tablets mention offerings of sweet milk and soured milk, each with distinct ceremonial purposes. Some of that milk, inevitably, fermented. Without refrigeration, how could it not? And rather than waste it, the Hittites leaned into the sourness, crafting soft cheeses and fermented drinks from the very process nature imposed. You imagine a noblewoman reclining on a cushioned bench, sipping from a shallow bowl. The drink is pale, thick, and tart, fermented mare's milk, perhaps. Cumies before the word ever existed. Its taste would be strange to your modern palate, smoky, slightly alcoholic, and faintly sweet. But for her, it's tonic, luxury, and likely skincare regimen all in one. Because here's the quirky tidbit. Among the fragments of Hittite beauty lore, some scholars found references to milk-based cleansing baths meant to preserve youth. These recipes called for milk of the mare, aged until it softens the skin like the moon. Translation: Sour Milk Facials, Bronze Age edition. Cleopatra would later take the credit, of course, but the Hittite queens got there first, with fewer marketing campaigns and a lot more flies. You can almost picture the scene, a servant carrying a clay bowl of curdled milk, steam rising as it's gently warmed near the hearth. The queen dips her fingers in, rubs the mixture over her face, and sighs as the scent of lactic acid fills the chamber. Somewhere, a goat bleats in protest. You can't help but smile. History always repeats itself in skincare fads. Historians still argue whether fermented dairy was a staple food or a side effect of poor storage. Some claim the Hittites deliberately fermented milk to prolong its life in the hot Anatolian climate. Others think it just happened naturally, and people grew to like the taste. Either way, by trial, error, and the occasional stomachache, they discovered something that changed survival into sustenance. You move toward a low stone bench that might once have served as a churning platform. On its surface lies a faint groove, worn smooth by centuries of motion. You press your hand against it, and for a moment you feel the rhythm, up and down, circular, repetitive. The slow churn of milk thickening into butter or sour cream. You hear phantom laughter, gossip, the clink of pottery. The daily ritual of transformation happening in the background of empire. You imagine how it smelled in here when it was alive: animal hide, firewood smoke, the tang of fermenting milk. The soundscape is vivid: wooden ladles knocking pots, the soft splash of liquid, the sigh of women exhaling as they work. Maybe one hums an old tune, something her grandmother taught her. The melody winds through the room like steam, rising with the scent of change. And then there's the royal angle. The Hittite kings dined on fermented delicacies most commoners could never afford. Archaeologists have found ornate jars with residue suggesting milk mixed with honey or herbs, a proto-yogurt smoothie fit for gods. Some contain traces of lactic acid and beeswax, implying that these concoctions doubled as medicinal balms. So yes, the first wellness influencers may have worn linen skirts and prayed to Tahut for good skin. A small jar catches your eye. Its mouth is narrow, its belly rounded, perfect for keeping liquids cool. The clay around it is etched with fine lines that might once have been decorative, but now resemble veins. You tilt it, and a puff of air escapes. The smell is faint but familiar, sour cream meeting rain-soaked stone. You think of modern kefir, of buttermilk, of the strange comfort that comes from something spoiled in all the right ways. You lean back against the wall, listening. Somewhere above, wind sighs through broken windows, echoing the slow exhalation of a cow at rest. You realize how close the Hittites lived to their animals, not just in labor, but in life philosophy. To them, fermentation was a pact with the living world. Grain, honey, milk, all agreeing to become something new through patience and faith. You smile at the thought of a priest blessing a vat of sour milk. Maybe he mumbles a prayer, sprinkles a few drops onto the ground for the underworld spirits, and declares it pure. Someone drinks it. Someone else laughs. Someone else complains. And time, ever patient, turns their skepticism into a recipe. You can't help but think about how fermentation mirrored their worldview. Death becoming life, decay reborn as nourishment. Even in milk, there was myth. The goddess of the sun fed the earth with her warmth, cows with her light, and humans with what they made from it. To taste sour milk was to taste sunlight translated through life itself. You glance at your reflection in a broken bronze bowl lying nearby. Your face looks distorted, the features swirling slightly in the curved metal. It reminds you of the way fermented milk swirls when stirred, a tiny reminder that nothing ever really holds still, not even history. A small joke bubbles up, you can't help it. You think, if ancient dairy counts as skincare, then technically yogurt is just face lotion with ambition. Somewhere, a Hittite queen would probably agree. The night grows deeper, and the sounds of the ruins settle again. You stand, brushing your palms against your thighs, and feel a lingering film of dust and time. In that quiet moment, the sourness in the air feels oddly comforting, like a promise that transformation, no matter how strange, always carries nourishment in disguise. The path tightens again, leading you through a corridor that smells faintly of clay dust and something metallic, like rain after lightning. Your flashlight sweeps over piles of broken pottery, and you realize these are not just storage vessels but relics of thought. Inscribed tablets, their surfaces cracked, the cuneiform faint but defiant. You squat, pick one up, and feel the indentations beneath your fingers, tiny wedges pressed by hands that believed words could trap both gods and recipes. You can almost imagine a scribe hunched over his clay, stylus tapping, trying to make sense of a process that always seemed alive and unpredictable. These are the tongues of clay, their silent whispers still warm in your imagination. Many of the Hittite fermentation secrets probably lived here once, etched between hymns and harvest tallies. But here's the frustrating truth. Half of what survives reads more like poetry than instruction. The mash shall awaken when the goddess breathes, one fragment says. Another advises, stir until the bubbles dance but not until they sing. You chuckle. Ancient cookbooks really were just as cryptic as the ones online. A mainstream historical fact. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of cuneiform tablets from Hattusa, and among them are texts referencing offerings of beer, wine, and bread. Yet none include complete brewing recipes. Instead, they blend ritual with practicality, half chemistry, half prayer. You can see why historians still argue whether these texts describe actual processes or symbolic acts meant for priests. Perhaps both. After all, to the Hittites, there wasn't much difference between a chemical reaction and divine intervention. You brush the edge of one tablet and feel a faint vibration, a trick of imagination, maybe, but it feels alive, humming like memory. You read another fragment aloud, the syllables awkward in your mouth. Zelanti sipped the foam of heaven. You have no idea what Zelanti means, though it sounds suspiciously like a brand of craft ale. You grin in the silence. As you set the fragment down, you notice the corner of another, still half buried. You dig it free with careful fingers. It's thicker, heavier, and surprisingly intact. The inscription is longer, lines of text with occasional pictograms. You trace one with your thumb, a bowl, a sunburst, a hand. Maybe mix at dawn. Maybe don't mess it up. Hard to say. Scholars have debated similar signs for decades. Some think they are instructions for offerings, others swear they are early fermentation guides. Historians still argue whether these markings represent literal actions or metaphorical guidance for spiritual purity before brewing. You think about that, how, for the Hittites, every act of creation had to balance precision and reverence. Brewing wasn't just making a drink, it was communing with time. Stirring wasn't about texture but intention. Every bubble was a syllable in a language of transformation. You pick up a smaller tablet, one scorched black at the edges. Its text is nearly gone, but a single word stands out, ninda, meaning bread. It sparks a thought. In Mesopotamian and Hittite culture alike, fermented bread dough often became beer base. Leftover loaves were soaked, mashed, and left to ferment. Bread and beer were twins, one baked, one drunk. You wonder if somewhere in these tablets, the scribe meant to write down the proper ratio of water to grain but got distracted mid-prayer. Maybe the gods were already whispering through the bubbles. The room smells faintly of clay and old smoke, the kind that seeps into everything. You imagine the scribe sitting here, surrounded by the hum of brewing beyond the walls, the distant clatter of jars, the hiss of steam, the low chanting of temple workers. Their task wasn't just to record, it was to translate chaos into clay. To give fleeting smells and sounds a permanent form. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. One of the most complete Hittite ritual texts describes the preparation of a fermented drink called kaluti, used during state festivals. The recipe is maddeningly vague. Mix the drink of the gods with sweet water and barley. That's it. No ratios, no steps, no fermentation times. Just faith. Maybe they assumed anyone making it already knew what sweet water meant. Or maybe secrecy was the point. Knowledge guarded by ambiguity. You hold one of the tablets closer to your flashlight, watching the letters cast tiny shadows. They look like miniature fields, rows of planted thoughts. You can't help but think, language itself is a kind of fermentation. Ideas steeping, bubbling, transforming over generations until no one remembers who first wrote them. The Hittites fermented not just food but meaning. You imagine a scribe grumbling as he writes, "How do you record something that only works if you believe in it?" He probably shrugs and adds a prayer at the end, just in case. You laugh quietly. Academia hasn't changed much. The walls here are covered in soot and streaks of dark mineral stains. You run your hand along one and realize the pattern repeats. Vertical streaks, like something once hung here. Maybe racks for drying clay tablets or wooden boards for mixing pastes. You picture apprentices darting back and forth, arms full of soft clay, trying not to drop the wisdom of the empire. And then you spot it, a broken stylus, barely longer than your thumb. It's made of bone, its tip flattened from use. You hold it between your fingers, and for a brief, eerie moment, you feel the echo of movement, a ghostly muscle memory. Tap, press, lift. The rhythm of writing, steady as a heartbeat. The same rhythm as stirring a pot of fermenting grain. You wonder if the scribes ever noticed the parallel, words and brews both needing patience, both growing alive under careful attention. You place the stylus back where you found it, careful not to disturb the dust. It seems wrong to pocket something that once touched ideas. You step back and take in the room one last time. Broken words, broken pots, and yet the air still feels articulate. Every fragment here once tried to explain the inexplicable, how ordinary ingredients become extraordinary by doing absolutely nothing. As you leave, the beam of your flashlight catches the corner of another tablet, barely legible. The final line reads something like, "May the jar sing softly and the heart remain calm." You smile at that. The Hittites understood fermentation as a reflection of self-control. A jar left too long erupts, a heart left too hot burns. Maybe that's why their prayers read like recipes and their recipes like meditations. You step into the corridor again, the air cooler now. The wind sighs through the ruins, and for a fleeting second, it almost sounds like clay tablets whispering, each one still murmuring its half-finished instructions into the dark. You listen, just long enough to catch a phrase that feels like advice for you, too. Patience bubbles before wisdom. The tunnel ahead narrows, swallowing your light until it becomes a narrow beam cutting through warm darkness. The air changes again, humid, vegetal, faintly sweet, as though the earth itself has been steeping in dew. You step carefully over a pile of fallen bricks, your shoes crunching in silence. Somewhere above, the night is clear, but here the air feels alive, thick with invisible motion. You can smell it before you see it, yeast. Wild, living, ancient yeast. You follow the scent to a small courtyard open to the sky, where moonlight pours down like spilled milk. Cracked pots sit in a circle, their rims lined with moss and dust. You kneel beside one, and the smell hits you full force, malted grain and wet stone, with that unmistakable tang of fermentation. This is where the Hittites courted the night itself, trusting it to breathe life into their brews. They didn't know what yeast was, not scientifically. To them, it was a spirit, an invisible guest that arrived only when properly invited. They called it the breath of the moon, a poetic name for a microbe, but not wrong. Yeast thrives in darkness, comes alive in warmth, and feeds on sweetness like a nocturnal thing. You picture women kneeling by jars at twilight, singing softly as they uncovered pots to let the night air in, as though coaxing spirits from the sky. A mainstream historical fact anchors the image. Hittite brewing sites often included open-air areas believed to be used for cooling and resting mash before fermentation. Archaeologists found traces of barley and emmer wheat in these spots, sometimes mixed with traces of pollen, hinting that the air, laden with local flora, played a role in their process. Historians still argue whether this was accidental or intentional, but anyone who's ever left dough uncovered overnight knows nature has its own agenda. You watch a strand of mist curl across the ground, pale in the moonlight. It looks almost alive, like breath on a cold morning. Maybe that's why they believed fermentation was lunar. The moon waxed and waned, and so did the froth in their jars. When it was full, the yeast sang, and when it waned, it slept. Their lives followed that rhythm: harvest, brew, rest, repeat. You lift your gaze upward, and the same pale disk that watched them still hangs above you, unbothered by the centuries. You crouch beside one jar and imagine how the ritual unfolded. At sunset, the brewers, often women, would soak grains in water drawn from wells only after certain prayers. They'd strain the mixture through woven reeds, then leave it under the stars for one night. In the morning, if the surface shimmered faintly and tiny bubbles formed, they knew the gods had breathed upon it. If not, the batch was discarded, or offered to the earth as appeasement. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts. Some ancient sources hint that Hittite women tied sprigs of wild thyme or barley stalks soaked in dew to their wrists while brewing, believing it helped attract the right kind of spirits. Imagine an entire brewery filled with softly singing women waving fragrant arms over pots, like some Bronze Age dance between ritual and microbiology. You chuckle quietly. If they only knew they were basically human yeast traps. The air hums around you, low and steady. You close your eyes and let it wash over your face. There's a sense of patience here, time stretching thin and warm, like rising dough. You imagine the Hittites waiting in the same silence, watching bubbles bloom and collapse in the moonlight, measuring success not by numbers but by the sound of fizz. The night would have smelled of barley, smoke, and something new being born. Historians still argue whether the Hittites recognized yeast as a transferable culture. Some evidence suggests they reused starter sediment from previous brews, an intuitive understanding of microbial continuity. Others think they simply reused jars out of habit, accidentally preserving the same colonies for generations. Either way, you realize that the line between ritual and routine was as thin as the film on top of their brews. You run your hand along one pot's rim, feeling the texture, rough, porous, still faintly sticky in the cool air. You imagine the original brewer leaning over it, muttering a charm, maybe cursing the flies. The yeast, indifferent, went on feasting, multiplying, creating alcohol and bubbles like an invisible city at work. You think about how little control they had and how much trust it required. Maybe that's the real lesson hidden here, that creation often begins with letting go. A breeze sweeps through the courtyard, stirring dust and the faintest scent of grass. You look up, and for a split second, the moonlight catches your breath. Literally, a small cloud forming and vanishing. It reminds you of their phrase, the breath of the moon. You grin softly. Maybe they were more observant than we give them credit for. Somewhere in this same courtyard, thousands of years ago, a batch must have gone wrong. The yeast too wild, the temperature too high, the result too sour. You picture the brewer scowling, muttering that Tahunt must be angry again, and dumping the mess onto the ground. The soil here must have absorbed countless experiments, countless half-failures and small triumphs. You wonder if that's why the air still feels so thick with presence, like the residue of hope itself. Another faint sound catches your ear, a soft pop, like a bubble breaking. You freeze. Of course it's not real, but you can't help smiling. The imagination has a funny way of filling in silence. You think of the countless pots that once lined this courtyard, each one bubbling softly in the dark, their froth catching moonlight like 1,000 tiny mirrors. A brewery and a galaxy, both alive at once. And maybe, just maybe, they saw it that way too. To them, the process wasn't just physical, it was cosmic. The rising bubbles mirrored stars, the hiss of fermentation echoed wind, the warmth of the mash reflected the sun's power captured in grain. They brewed not just to drink, but to reenact creation itself. Order emerging from chaos, sweetness from rot, life from what had already begun to decay. You take a slow breath, savoring the idea. You think about your own world, controlled, sanitized, digital, and how far removed it is from this kind of trust in the unknown. You can't code yeast, can't algorithm your way into bubbles. You can only wait, watch, and hope. Maybe that's why the Hittite brewers sang. Maybe the song was less for the gods and more for themselves, a reminder that patience, too, is an act of faith. You stand, brushing dust from your knees. The courtyard feels warmer now, as if the ground still remembers its old duty, to nurture transformation in silence. The moonlight catches the edge of a jar, and you catch your reflection, warped and shimmering. You smile and whisper, just to the air, "Sleep well, old yeast." And the air, as if in answer, exhales again. The sour, sweet scent of yeast fades as you step through a cracked archway, and suddenly the air smells of fruit, ripe, sticky, and half forgotten. You shine your light downward. The floor here is uneven, the stone mottled crimson, as though it once drank 1,000 summers. You're standing in what was probably a fermentation cellar for fruit wines, and the perfume still lingers like an afterimage of sunlight. You kneel beside a toppled jar, its lid still clinging by a thread of resin. The residue inside glows dull red under your beam. You dip a fingertip through dust and feel grit give way to something smooth. Pomegranate, of course. The Hittites loved the fruit almost as much as they loved the gods who allegedly invented it. Its juice dyed fabrics, sealed treaties, and, as you now know, bubbled happily into wine. A mainstream historical fact anchors your discovery. Chemical analyses from Hittite sites have revealed tartaric acid crystals, the telltale fingerprint of ancient fruit wine. Archaeologists even found traces of resin used as an early preservative, the ancestor of modern retsina. You picture the jars lined along a palace wall, each one breathing quietly as sugars surrendered to alcohol. The air feels warmer here. You imagine servants carrying baskets of fruit, pomegranate, fig, maybe even grape, crushing them with bare feet in shallow stone vats. The juice runs between their toes, cool and slick. Someone laughs, someone curses the flies, someone sneezes when a seed pops unexpectedly. A symphony of messy joy. Then the liquid is poured into clay jars, sealed with wax or resin, and left to dream in the dark. Historians still argue whether the Hittites learned winemaking from the coastal peoples or discovered it independently. Anatolia was rich with wild grapes, but pomegranate and fig were local favorites, reliable even in drought. Maybe trade brought the technique, maybe boredom did. Either way, the result was intoxicating enough to warrant poems about the crimson sleep of the gods. You kind of wish modern tasting notes were that poetic. You run your hand across the wall. It's streaked with faint vertical stains where liquid once dripped, a slow watercolor of centuries. The smell of resin thickens, sharp and piney. The Hittites used it not only to preserve wine but to sanctify it, the resin from sacred trees binding the drink to divine essence. You imagine a priest uncorking a jar, the aroma of pine and pomegranate rising like a forest caught in a bottle. A quirky tidbit surfaces from memory. Some Hittite inscriptions mention fruit of the underworld offered in liquid form. Scholars think it might refer to pomegranate wine used in funerary rites. To drink it was to taste rebirth, to pour it was to guide the dead. You glance at the dark stains beneath your boots and can't help whispering, "Cheers, whoever you were." You can almost see the ritual, a courtyard blazing with torches, the hum of flutes, the air thick with sweetness. The officiant raises a bronze cup filled with deep red liquid. To the storm, to the soil, to what sleeps below. The crowd echoes the words, each voice low and reverent. Then silence as they sip, eyes half closed, feeling the warmth crawl through them like memory. You brush dust from a fragment of pottery. The glaze still holds a faint pattern, interlocking circles like ripples on water. Maybe the artist was trying to capture the way fermenting wine bubbles, the slow dance of gas escaping the surface. There's something oddly tender about that idea, trying to paint motion into permanence. You find yourself thinking about the human urge to control decay, to cage it, tame it, turn it into something beautiful. The Hittites did it with fruit. We do it with code and deadlines. Different jars, same instinct. You tilt another vessel upright, and a faint hiss escapes, just the sigh of centuries releasing trapped air. The smell is astonishing, sweet, dusty, a whisper of oxidized wine. It's faint but unmistakable. You close your eyes and inhale, tasting ghosts. For a heartbeat, you understand why they called it forbidden sweetness. Not forbidden because it was sinful, but because it always slipped away, first to vapor, then to memory. You picture a Hittite girl sneaking into this very cellar centuries ago. She's supposed to be carrying grain to the kitchen, but curiosity wins. She pries open a lid, scoops a sip, coughs, laughs, and replaces the seal. That night she dreams of crimson rivers and golden bees. The next morning she swears she saw Tahunt himself wink from a thundercloud. Every good vintage starts with a small act of rebellion. Historians still argue about the level of alcohol these wines reached. Without distillation, the process likely stopped around 10%, but clay insulation and resin sealing may have allowed stronger batches. A few scholars even propose spontaneous secondary fermentations, nature's version of sparkling wine. The phrase bubbling god juice doesn't appear in any translation, but you suspect it should. You trace one crack along the floor and realize it connects several jars. Drainage channels, clever design. Spilled wine would have flowed back into the earth, returning offerings to the soil instead of wasting them. Even in luxury, they practiced circular economy long before it was trendy. You imagine how the cellar must have looked when it was alive, shelves stacked with jars of every size, soft light from oil lamps flickering over liquid shadows. Workers moved quietly, checking seals, listening for the faint fizz that meant success. A perfect stillness punctuated only by tiny, persistent sounds, the murmur of fermentation, the heartbeat of transformation. You let the image settle around you. The scent, the silence, the echo of laughter long gone. You realize how much of civilization's joy was built on waiting. Waiting for grain to sprout, milk to sour, fruit to bubble. Waiting for invisible guests to do their work. You exhale and almost feel bubbles rise inside you in sympathy. Before leaving, you lift one tiny shard of red-stained pottery and hold it up to the light. The color still glows faintly, like the last ember of a feast. You whisper, "Don't worry, I'll remember," and set it gently back down. Outside, the moonlight paints everything silver, but under your fingertips the scent of pomegranate clings, a ghost of sweetness that refuses to fade. When you leave the wine cellar, the air grows rougher, drier, almost bitter. The sweetness of fruit fades into something sharp, like crushed herbs underfoot. You squint against a sudden gust of dust and realize you've stepped into the workshop of brewers and healers, the place where fermentation crossed from food into medicine. Clay jars crowd the shelves, smaller than the beer vats or wine urns, each stoppered with fabric or wax. If you listen closely, you swear you can still hear the faint crackle of dried leaves. You crouch near one jar and tap its side. The sound is hollow, almost melodic. You imagine how it once sloshed with concoctions, herbal brews, vinegar infusions, strange syrups meant to heal and harm alike. The Hittites, after all, weren't content just to drink fermentation, they prescribed it. They trusted sourness to purge sickness, rot to counter rot. It's oddly poetic, the idea that decay could be the cure. A mainstream historical fact gives shape to your thought. Clay tablets from Hattusa list medicinal recipes involving fermented barley water, honey wine mixed with herbs, and sour milk infused with garlic. These weren't accidental, they were deliberate medicinal preparations. Archaeologists even found residue of Acetobacter, the same bacteria that turns wine to vinegar, inside certain labeled vessels. The line between apothecary and brewery was blurry at best. You pull one jar closer and tilt it, watching the light catch the faint shimmer inside. It smells of vinegar and thyme. You can almost taste it, pungent, acidic, alive. The Hittite healers must have prized this tang as proof of potency. The stronger the sting, the closer it was to the gods. Historians still argue whether the Hittites recognized vinegar as a distinct substance or merely a spoiled form of wine. Some claim they intentionally created it for medicinal and cleaning purposes. Others think it was the result of heat and carelessness. But even if by accident, someone must have noticed that a wound rinsed with sour wine healed faster than one washed with plain water. You can almost hear the first startled gasp of recognition. Rotter's remedy. You run a finger over the rim of another vessel, this one etched with spiral designs. Inside, a faint residue clings to the bottom, something darker, thicker. Honeymead turned medicinal, maybe. The Hittites believed honey was sacred, a gift of the gods of fertility and health. Mixed with fermented vinegar, it became a panacea of sorts, a Bronze Age prototype for oxymel, still used millennia later. You grin to yourself. Leave it to ancient Anatolia to invent trendy health tonics centuries before influencers. A quirky tidbit drifts from the depths of your memory. One text describes the drink that cools fever and bones, a mixture of sour beer, crushed mint, and river clay. It was to be consumed under the light of a half moon while reciting a charm to the Lady of Wells. You can't help laughing softly, half pharmacist, half poet. They might have killed you with hygiene standards, but at least the branding was memorable. You walk farther into the chamber. The shelves tilt like old teeth. Some jars are labeled with small marks, symbols of serpents, suns, and leaves. Maybe the Hittites used them as shorthand for ingredients or outcomes. Good for belly, bad for demons. Do not drink before war. You touch one marked with a lightning bolt and wonder what it held. Fermented garlic? Burnt barley tonic? The possibilities smell both fascinating and dangerous. The air is thick with the ghost of vinegar. You take a slow breath, and your eyes sting slightly. You imagine a healer hovering over a feverish child, spooning thin sour wine into cracked lips. The bitterness would bite, but the body would calm, the stomach settle. Science might not have existed yet, but observation had centuries of practice. You find a cracked tablet half buried in the dirt. Its surface is faintly etched with words you can't read, but a single drawing remains clear, a jar with vapors rising, and above it, a hand held in blessing. The meaning couldn't be clearer, fermentation as prayer. The act of waiting for transformation mirrored waiting for healing. Faith, patience, and bubbles, all part of the same treatment plan. A small sound echoes from the far corner, water dripping, slow and rhythmic. You follow it, stepping over fallen jars until you find a small basin carved into the floor. It's lined with crystalline residue, salt, maybe. You dip your fingers in. The moisture smells faintly sour. A fermentation pit for brine mixtures. The Hittites pickled everything from onions to river fish, and some recipes doubled as medicines. Salted, soured fish sauce, for instance, was used to clean wounds and flavor stews alike. You wince. That's dedication. Historians still argue whether these dual-purpose brews were the result of desperation or discovery. Maybe they learned by necessity during famines. Maybe they genuinely believed in the spiritual power of rot. Either way, the concept survived. The very vinegar you drizzle on salad today carries echoes of their Sikrim concoctions. You're basically eating ancient medicine with your greens. Congratulations. You linger by the basin, feeling oddly humbled. Imagine trusting your health to invisible forces you didn't understand, brewing hope in clay jars, and waiting weeks for results. Modern pills work faster, sure, but there's something noble in their patience. Every sour whiff in this room smells like courage disguised as chemistry. A faint glimmer catches your eye, a small bronze cup, greened with age, lying beside an overturned jar. You lift it carefully. The interior is lined with something dark, almost glassy. Resin, perhaps. Or dried syrup. You tilt it, and for a moment it catches your reflection. You look tired, dusty, slightly amused, exactly how the ancient healers probably looked after a long day of mixing. You raise the empty cup to your lips in a mock toast and murmur, "To the cure that tastes terrible." Somewhere, a drop of water falls, echoing like laughter. The smell of vinegar follows you as you leave the chamber, sharp but strangely invigorating. You imagine the healer's hands, sticky with honey and herbs, their faces lit by oil lamps, eyes shining with hope that something spoiled might save a life. You smile. They might not have known the word microbe, but they understood something far rarer. Transformation always begins in the unseen. You step out of the healer's den and into a corridor where the walls glint faintly with mineral sheen. The smell shifts again, from sour herbs to something saltier, earthier, faintly oceanic. You take a few slow steps forward, and the sound changes under your boots, gritty, granular, like walking across dried salt. You've entered the Hittite salting chambers, where preservation and fermentation blurred into one long gamble against time. At first glance, it looks almost like a mine, carved troughs filled with coarse white crystals, wooden racks leaning against the walls. The air is dry enough to sting your nostrils. But mixed with the sharpness of salt is another scent, aged fat, smoke, maybe dried fish. It's the smell of survival. The Hittites, you realize, lived far from any coastline, yet somehow managed to master the art of preserving fish and meat through fermentation. That's your first mainstream historical fact. Archaeological digs in central Anatolia have uncovered residues of fish oil and brine-soaked bones hundreds of miles from the sea. The trade networks that carried copper and tin also carried barrels of salted fish from coastal partners. And the Hittites, practical as ever, found ways to turn those shipments into lasting stores of protein. You crouch beside a stone trough, now dry and lined with crystals. You drag a fingertip through the salt. It's sharp, cold, still faintly oily after thousands of years. You imagine chunks of fish laid here, salt, fish, herbs, repeat, until the trough became a living thing. Over weeks, enzymes worked their secret alchemy, breaking flesh into liquid gold. You can almost hear it, the faint squelch, the hiss of fermentation trapped beneath stone lids. Historians still argue whether the Hittites made something like garum, the fish sauce that later defined Roman cuisine, or if their versions were closer to salty pastes or pickled fillets. Some claim the similarities are too strong to ignore. Others insist Anatolia's climate and inland trade made their process unique. You think it's entirely possible they invented their own umami before the word had ever crossed a tongue. A jar near your foot bears faded red pigment, possibly a symbol for water or life. You lift the lid, expecting dust, but instead find a thin layer of dark residue clinging to the bottom. You lean closer, catching a faint whiff of something that can only be described as ancient anchovy apocalypse. You pull back quickly, laughing softly. Even 3,000 years later, fermented fish still has that effect. You picture a kitchen scene in a Hittite fortress, a cook in a linen apron stirring a thick, brownish paste in a ceramic bowl. The smell must have been overwhelming, half rot, half glory. A visiting dignitary probably wrinkled his nose, but then he tasted it, and his eyes widened. Salt, savor, depth, an edible paradox. Somewhere, a cook grinned triumphantly and muttered, "Told you so." A quirky tidbit from the records. One offering list mentions the source of the storm god's feast, made of fish, salt, and date syrup. No one's sure what that meant exactly, but the combination suggests an early attempt to balance sweetness and fermentation. Imagine a drizzle of umami syrup over roasted lamb, a Bronze Age barbecue glaze fit for deities. You trace a hand along the wall, feeling rough carvings that might once have marked storage tallies. Each groove a promise against famine. Salt was more than a preservative, it was currency, protection, a ward against spirits. The Hittites even used the phrase to eat salt together as a metaphor for alliance. You like that? It makes every shared meal a treaty of trust. You picture laborers hauling heavy jars of brine down into this cool chamber, the liquid sloshing, their arms burning. Each jar a gamble, too little salt, and everything spoiled, too much, and nothing fermented. Finding the balance must have been both art and prayer. You imagine them tasting a drop now and then, grimacing, nodding, adjusting. Some of those first taste testers deserve statues. Historians still argue whether these salted fermentations served more as trade goods or dietary staples. Some evidence suggests they were luxury items reserved for elites, while others point to everyday uses in soldier rations. Either way, the process carried meaning. Control over decay was control over fate. A sudden draft whistles through the chamber, and for a second you could swear it smells like sea air. You blink, caught off guard. Maybe your mind is playing tricks, or maybe the salt still remembers where it came from. The long journey from coast to mountain, from wave to jar. You take another breath and let the illusion linger. You crouch again, brushing dust from a large clay bowl embedded in the floor. It's wider than your arms, its edges chipped but strong. At its base is a carved relief, fish intertwined with lightning bolts. Hunt again, the storm god, patron of renewal. The message feels clear enough. Transformation through turbulence. It's fitting. Fermentation is just controlled chaos, after all. You picture storms rolling over Anatolia, thunder shaking the ground while jars below bubble and hiss. Maybe the brewers listened to the thunder and smiled, believing it blessed their work. In a way, it did. Every rumble, every vibration stirred the invisible worlds inside those jars. The gods were good mixers. A small laugh escapes you, part amusement, part awe. You think about how many of humanity's best flavors come from things that technically went bad first. Salted fish, blue cheese, soy sauce, kimchi, they all trace back to someone like these Hittite experimenters, squinting into a jar and thinking, well, it doesn't smell worse than yesterday. You find a small wooden spatula fossilized in salt, its edge still crusted with residue. You lift it gently, half expecting it to crumble, but it holds firm. You imagine its owner stirring, tasting, judging. The motion is universal, timeless. You dip it through the air and whisper, "Still good," just to hear the sound bounce softly off the walls. As you leave the chamber, the salt clings to your lips. It's dry, gritty, but not unpleasant. You lick it away, and for a fleeting moment, you taste the ghost of something savory, deep, and ancient. It lingers like memory. Faint, persistent, utterly human. You realize that every civilization, no matter how grand or forgotten, has always depended on people brave enough to let things rot, just the right amount. The salt tang fades behind you, replaced by the deep, earthen scent of smoke and clay. You step into a wide hall, the walls blackened from centuries of fires. A hearth pit yawns in the center, its edges ringed with soot, its heart cold but unmistakably once alive. This is where heat and fermentation met, where the Hittites learned that warmth wasn't just for comfort or cooking, it could steer transformation itself. You take a slow step closer. The floor crunches beneath your boots, fragments of charred wood mingle with shards of pottery. The air feels dense, as though the stone still holds breath from long-vanished flames. The scent of smoke mingled with sweetness lingers faintly, a hint of burnt grain, maybe, or honey caramelized before its time. You can almost hear the crackle of kindling and the soft sigh of boiling pots. The mainstream historical fact emerges from memory. Hittite hearths weren't just for heat, they were multifunctional fermentation zones. Archaeologists discovered that fermentation vessels were often stored near ovens, suggesting the ancients used residual warmth to accelerate processes. In colder seasons, the hearth became a living incubator for bread starters, beer mash, and curdled milk. Essentially, they had invented the Bronze Age version of temperature control. You kneel by the hearth and brush soot from the edge. Underneath lies a faint red glow. No, just iron oxide catching your light, but for a moment it looks alive. You imagine the baker, the brewer, and the cook all sharing this same fire, each one arguing about who gets to place their pot nearest the coals. You smile. Human kitchen politics haven't evolved much. Historians still argue whether the Hittites fully understood the effect of controlled heat on fermentation. Some suggest they merely stumbled upon it while keeping mash from freezing. Others believe they recognized that warmth encouraged the god's breath to move faster. In any case, you realize, what they lacked in thermometers, they made up for in intuition. You run a hand along the bricks. They are rough but smooth in patches, worn shiny where countless jars once rested. You picture them arranged around the perimeter, some wrapped in straw, others sealed with mud to hold steady temperatures. The smell of warm yeast and grain must have filled the air, mingling with wood smoke and laughter. Then comes the quirky tidbit. Some scholars believe Hittite brewers placed small offerings of grain or oil into the fire before setting their jars nearby, a symbolic act to feed both gods and yeast alike. Imagine throwing a handful of barley into the flames and whispering, "Don't burn us, just bless us." You chuckle softly. The world's first temperature calibration by divine negotiation. You find a low clay platform beside the hearth, an ancient proofing table, perhaps. On its surface, faint impressions remain, the ghostly outlines of baskets once used to hold dough. You touch the indentations, and suddenly it's easy to picture the scene, a baker leaning forward, sweat on his brow, carefully lifting a cloth to check the rise. His apprentice hovers beside him, eager but clumsy. The older man grunts, "Not yet," then throws another log on the fire. The room hums in your imagination, the rhythm of preparation, of transformation balanced between too cold and too hot. The flames flicker orange, and the jars beside them glisten with condensation. You can almost smell the sweet tang of fermenting dough, that unmistakable promise of bread waiting to become itself. You remember the beer brewers, the cheese makers, the healers from earlier sections, each relying on temperature in their own way. Here, all those threads weave together in heat. Fire isn't destruction anymore, it's coaxing, persuasion. You think of the Hittites crouched by the hearth, testing warmth with bare palms, reading the fire like language. They didn't just use flame, they conversed with it. Historians still argue whether the Hittites saw fire as divine or domestic. In some myths, it's the breath of gods. In others, it's the hearth mother's domain. But standing here, you sense it was both. Fire gave them light, protection, and control, the essential ingredients of civilization itself. You pick up a small lump of fused clay from the ground. Embedded within are tiny charred seeds, barley, maybe. They look like cinders, yet their structure remains perfect. You turn the piece in your hand, thinking how a moment of overheat preserved them for millennia. A small mistake turned into archaeology's greatest gift. Somewhere, that baker would probably mutter, "You're welcome." A gust of wind stares us into the air, and it dances like ghostly snowfall. You watch it settle on your sleeve and realize how thin the line is between life and dust. The same warmth that quickened yeast could also destroy it. The same fire that nurtured could consume. Balance was everything. The Hittites lived in that balance daily, steering their invisible transformations with instinct rather than instruments. You step closer to the hearth again. Its cavity is filled with shadows, but the edges still gleam faintly red. You can almost hear whispers, perhaps the echo of old arguments about when to move the jars or how long to leave the mash. You imagine laughter breaking through frustration, the sound of a clay lid being lifted, the sigh of success when the bubbles looked right. There's another, subtler scent here, something resinous and floral. You realize it's the remnant of wood they once burned, juniper, pine, oak. The smoke wasn't accidental, it flavored everything, cheese, beer, bread. The Hittites unknowingly invented smoked fermentation, the rustic flavor your modern palate still craves. You grin. Somewhere in a high-end restaurant, a chef is charging extra for what these people did by necessity. You crouch and drag a finger through ash, watching it swirl. It feels almost alive, soft, weightless, fragile. You remember how each earlier fermentation relied on time. Now you see it relied on temperature too. Between warmth and waiting, they built an entire culinary philosophy. You imagine the night deepening outside, snow falling on the mountain tops, and inside this hearth room, the glow of coals holding off the cold. Someone yawns, someone stirs a pot, someone hums an old tune. The jars around them whisper in return, their invisible contents transforming under the quiet discipline of heat. You stay a moment longer, your hands warming near a fire that's long gone but somehow still radiating memory. And you think, maybe that's what all fermentation is, a conversation with warmth, time, and patience. The Hittites just happened to speak the language first. The hearth's warmth fades as you move onward, replaced by the cool hush of open air. You step through a broken lintel, and the night greets you again, soft, quiet, heavy with stars. For the first time in a while, you can smell life rather than the ghosts of it. Grass, damp earth, the faint buzz of insects. The path ahead curves downward, leading toward what looks like a terraced slope dotted with clay cisterns. At first glance, it seems like a vineyard, or what's left of one. You crouch and brush away dust from the soil. It's rich and dark, flecked with crushed shells and tiny pebbles. Whoever worked this land knew their craft. You stand and take in the scene, ancient irrigation channels, a line of stone troughs, and, there, a low circular structure you instantly recognize. A communal fermenting pit. This is where the people gathered, not the priests or nobles, but farmers, shepherds, and workers. You can almost hear them, laughter, shouting, the splash of buckets. Here, fermentation wasn't ritual or luxury, it was survival turned social. The mainstream historical fact rises easily from memory. Hittite society relied heavily on communal grain and drink production, especially during harvest. Archaeological surveys of rural Anatolia reveal shade wine presses and beer brewing pits designed for multiple households. The resulting brews weren't for kings, they were for everyone. They were wages, celebration, and morale all in one clay jar. You walk closer to the pit. It's wide enough for 6 people to stand inside, its inner surface polished smooth by time and use. You kneel and inhale. There's still a faint earthy sweetness, like old bread or autumn apples. You run your hand along the inside, feeling tiny grooves that once helped mash grain or fruit. This wasn't a place of silence, it was a place of song. You imagine the scene centuries ago, men and women working side by side, stomping grain mash or grapes, their feet slick with juice, their laughter rolling across the fields. Someone plays a reed flute, someone claps, and someone inevitably slips, turning the task into a game. The smell of fermentation would have mingled with sweat and soil, a human alchemy in motion. Historians still argue whether these communal fermentations were organized by the state or by local custom. Some point to tablet records detailing grain owed to the pit, suggesting taxation in the form of contribution. Others believe villagers simply cooperated to ensure everyone had enough for the winter. Either way, the result was the same, a shared drink that turned labor into celebration. A quirky tidbit bubbles up, literally. One Hittite inscription describes a festival where villagers sing until the foam covers the rim. Scholars think it refers to communal beer making, but you like to imagine it as a metaphor for joy spilling over. The same principle applies today. Any party worth attending should probably end in bubbles. You notice the remnants of wooden posts that once supported a canopy. Shade, protection from birds, maybe even a place for hanging herbs used to flavor the mash. You pick up a brittle stalk of something dry and fragrant, coriander, or perhaps fennel. The Hittites flavored their brews not just for taste, but for symbolism. Coriander for fertility, fennel for endurance, mint for clarity. They brewed meaning right into the drink. You step down into the pit, the echo of your movement soft and hollow. The walls rise around you, curving like the belly of a massive drum. You whisper a word, and it bounces back gentle, almost melodic. You realize how acoustically perfect this place is. Maybe that's why they sang while they worked. The sound itself must have vibrated through the liquid, the mash, the air. It feels like standing inside a song. For a moment, you close your eyes and imagine the day of a festival. The pit filled, the mash churning, the air thick with aroma. Children running in circles, dogs barking, the village head making an overly long toast. Then silence, everyone raises clay cups, and the first sip burns sweet and raw. It's probably slightly sour, maybe a little gritty, but no one minds. It tastes of work and reward, and one more season survived. Historians still argue whether these brews fermented naturally in open pits or were later transferred to jars for aging. Both methods make sense. You can almost see the villagers sealing jars with mud, setting them under shade, and waiting for bubbles to calm. The patience of the process mirrored their lives. Sow, wait, reap, repeat. You trace a small groove carved into the side of the pit, a spout, for draining finished liquid into smaller containers. Ingenious. You imagine the first drops flowing out, golden and foamy, catching the sunlight. Someone cheers. Someone else yells, "Not yet." Too late. The tradition of sneaking early sips was probably born right here. A sudden thought hits you. Fermentation wasn't just preservation, it was community glue. You can almost feel the collective rhythm of those days. Everyone contributed grain, fruit, or labor. Everyone shared in the result. The transformation wasn't only chemical, it was social. A faint breeze brushes past, carrying the scent of grass and damp earth. You look up at the stars, so many they almost shimmer like bubbles. Maybe that's what drew them to gather at night, under the same lights, breathing the same air, waiting for the same invisible miracle to finish its work. You crouch again and scoop a handful of soil. It smells faintly sweet, decay and growth tangled together. The same principle that fed their fermentation fed the land itself. The waste from brewing became fertilizer. The circle never broke. They didn't just practice sustainability, they lived it instinctively. You think about modern life for a moment, about how much noise surrounds every simple thing. Here, all it took was grain, water, time, and trust. The Hittites didn't measure yeast percentages or sugar levels, they measured patience. You exhale slowly and feel something settle in your chest, a kind of quiet admiration for their uncomplicated genius. You climb out of the pit, brushing dust from your knees. The night feels softer now. Behind you, the terraced fields glow faintly in starlight. You imagine them full of laughter once again, filled with the hum of shared purpose. Somewhere, in some distant echo, a song still lingers, steady, rhythmic, alive. And for a brief, impossible moment, you swear you hear it, a low, wordless chant rising with the wind. The song of bubbles and breath, of people trusting the unseen. You smile and whisper, "Keep singing." The air answers with silence, but a warm kind, the kind that hums just beneath hearing, like something still fermenting in the dark. You leave the communal pit behind and follow a trail that winds uphill, where the grass grows thin and the stones gleam pale in moonlight. The air sharpens, the night feels brittle, as if every sound might shatter it. Somewhere ahead, you catch the faint smell of something sour, almost medicinal. You pause, nose twitching, and realize it's coming from a low cluster of huts built into the slope. As you draw closer, you see shallow clay bowls laid out on flat rocks, each holding a thick, grayish mash. Flies hum lazily above it. It doesn't look appetizing, it looks like something forgotten. But the smell, tart, earthy, faintly sweet, is strangely familiar. You lean closer, and then it clicks. Spoiled mash. Fermentation gone wrong. And yet, not entirely. A woman's voice drifts from one of the huts, singing softly, a lullaby in a language long gone. You step toward the doorway and peer inside. The interior glows dimly from a tallow lamp. On a woven mat lies a child, pale and sweating. The woman dips a cloth into one of the bowls and presses it to the child's arm. The smell intensifies, sharp, pungent, alive. You realize what you're seeing. Medicine. The mainstream historical fact echoes in your mind. Ancient civilizations often used fermented substances as primitive antibiotics or healing poultices. While the Hittites couldn't name penicillium, they knew that certain spoiled grains could draw infection out of wounds. Text fragments from Hattusa even reference bread of mold for the swollen limb. You watch her wring out the cloth and apply it again, murmuring what might be a prayer. The child stares, sighs, and slowly relaxes. The air in the hut is thick with humidity, but it feels safe somehow, as if even decay has decided to be kind tonight. Historians still argue whether such treatments were intentional discoveries or happy accidents. Did some long-ago brewer notice that moldy mash healed a cut? Or did divine superstition push them to smear offerings of spoiled grain on the sick, only to find it worked? The truth probably lies in that gray space between faith and observation. You crouch near the doorway, careful not to startle the woman, though she seems not to see you anyway. You can almost hear her inner rhythm: dip, press, sing, breathe. Each movement is both ritual and instinct. In the corner, more jars rest under damp cloths, their contents various shades of green and blue. You know those colors: fungus, alive and multiplying. Somewhere in that chaos, penicillin's ancestor is already at work. You step back outside, letting the night air clear your lungs. The smell lingers on your clothes, a strange mix of life and rot. You glance around and realize this little cluster of huts might have been a healer's quarter. Mortar stones, drying herbs, animal bones, everything here speaks of improvisation and care. The quirky tidbit slides into your mind like a whisper. Some Hittite healers supposedly tested the strength of their poultices by dipping feathers into them. If the feather stiffened or dissolved, they'd declare the mixture either blessed or cursed. Early chemistry, disguised as divine omen reading. You grin. Science by superstition, the most human method there is. You wander toward the edge of the slope. Below, the village glimmers faintly with starlight reflecting off hundreds of clay pots. Every one of those vessels could contain something miraculous or disastrous. Fermentation was always a gamble, a conversation between hope and spoilage. You kneel beside one of the bowls left outside. The surface has formed a thin crust. When you poke it gently, bubbles release with a faint hiss. The smell is acrid but not unbearable. You imagine a desperate family discovering this strange mash after all else failed, smearing it on wounds out of sheer necessity. You think about the moment, pain easing, fever breaking, and the realization that rot could heal. That's not just discovery, that's alchemy. Historians still argue whether the Hittites' use of spoiled grain influenced later medical traditions. Some trace parallels to Egyptian mold bread, others to Mesopotamian healing dough. But no one can quite prove the line of transmission. Knowledge travels oddly, through rumor, migration, and sometimes, fermentation itself. You stand and stretch. The sky above is clear now, the moon sharp-edged and white. You can almost see the invisible threads connecting these ancient experiments to modern labs, petri dishes and microscopes tracing their lineage back to this very hill. The same curiosity, the same stubborn refusal to waste what seems ruined. You wander deeper among the huts, and your foot nudges something small. You look down, a cracked clay tablet, half buried in doubt. You brush it off, and the faint marks become legible, cuneiform, of course. You can only pick out a few signs, but one phrase stands clear: bread of sickness turned to blessing. You exhale, almost laughing. The first recorded thank you note to mold. Inside another hut, you find a large stone basin, blackened with age. Its rim bears finger marks, permanent evidence of countless mixes and rinses. The basin smells faintly metallic, maybe from old blood or minerals. You run your fingers along it and feel the grit of residue, thick, almost sticky. The healer's workbench. You can almost hear her voice, instructing an apprentice. This one burns too fast, add milk. That one smells sharp, keep it for wounds. It's not guesswork, it's inherited wisdom, generations deep. The village didn't survive by accident. It thrived because someone, long ago, trusted the intuition that rot could be harnessed, that decay wasn't the end but another stage of life. You think of modern antibiotics again, of how that same principle, life battling life, saves billions now. It began here, on a hillside where a woman sang lullabies to mold. You can't help but smile at the symmetry of it. The night grows colder. A thin mist curls through the grass. You take one last look at the huts, their outlines soft, their silence full of memory. Somewhere inside, the bowls still bubble faintly, as though the process never truly stopped. You step away, back onto the path, and the sour tang fades behind you. What lingers isn't disgust but reverence. The Hittites may not have known what microbes were, but they understood something deeper. That sometimes, salvation hides in the spoiled. And as you descend toward the valley, the air feels lighter, almost clean, as though even the wind carries a trace of that ancient remedy, healing what time alone could not. The slope levels out beneath your feet, and a wide valley stretches before you, a quilt of shadowed hills, pale rivers, and forgotten roads. You can almost hear the murmur of traders drifting through time, the creak of wagon wheels, the snort of donkeys, the gossip of merchants whose pockets and tongues were equally quick. The Hittite world was never still, it pulsed with exchange. You descend toward what must have been a caravan rest stop once, a scatter of broken amphorae and tumbled stones. Under the moonlight, the shards glitter faintly, their curved surfaces catching your eye like ancient coins. You kneel, lift one, and feel the faint ridges of an inscription. Not words this time, just a symbol, a stylized swirl that might represent fermentation itself, a spiral of air and motion. The mainstream historical fact surfaces easily. The Hittite Empire sat at the crossroads of major Bronze Age trade routes, linking the Aegean, Mesopotamia, and Levant. They moved not just metals and horses, but food technologies, fermented grains, curds, and wines among them. Every amphora carried more than liquid, it carried knowledge. You picture the caravans rolling east, west, and south, their cargoes sloshing gently in sealed jars. Barley beer heading toward the Greeks, honey mead drifting toward Canaan, sour milk curds bound for Babylon. You grin at the thought. The ancient world united not by treaties, but by the shared desire for a good buzz and a long shelf life. Historians still argue whether the Hittites exported finished brews or just the recipes. Evidence points both ways. Trade tablets mention yeast lumps and starter jars, suggesting microbial diplomacy centuries before refrigeration. Imagine a merchant bartering not for gold, but for a scoop of the right sludge to start his next batch. Now that's a transaction. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. Certain shipwrecks off the Turkish coast have yielded amphorae that, when analyzed, contained residues of both barley and pomegranate, proof that ancient traders loved hybrid drinks. You imagine a Hittite salesman bragging, "It's a beer, it's a wine, it's both." History's first hard seltzer, more or less. You walk along what used to be a road, flat stones worn smooth by wheels and hooves. On either side lie fragments of trade posts, walls of mud brick, scattered weights, a half-buried scale. Somewhere nearby, a faint metallic chime echoes, perhaps the wind teasing a piece of bronze. You follow it until you find a broken belt buckle shaped like a grape cluster. Small, delicate, and clearly decorative. Trade wasn't just about survival, it was about identity, prestige, even style. You can almost see the scene play out. A merchant pours a cup of strange, fizzy liquid for a foreign buyer. The man sniffs, hesitates, sips, and grins. The deal is sealed. Fermentation didn't just preserve food, it preserved trust. The shared intoxication became a universal language. You think of how ideas spread like yeast, quiet, invisible, unstoppable. Somewhere along these routes, the Hittite knack for managing microbes mingled with Egyptian precision and Mesopotamian ritual. Techniques morphed, flavors shifted, and cultures intertwined. Every sip someone took on the road was part of that grand experiment. Historians still argue whether the Hittites learned winemaking from the Mycenaeans or taught it to them. The evidence is a tug-of-war. Hittite sites show early presses and vats, but Greek ruins reveal later perfection. Maybe it wasn't a question of who taught whom. Maybe it was a feedback loop, a slow fermentation of knowledge shared between hands and tongues. You pass a small shrine built from piled stones, probably once dedicated to the god of travelers. A faint carving still marks the center, a hand holding a cup. You smile, even their prayers were poured. You place your fingers on the carving and imagine the thousands who stopped here, offering a sip before moving on. Maybe they believed the gods preferred their offerings slightly fermented too. A gust of dry wind rushes through the valley, carrying the scent of thyme and dust. You pull your cloak tighter, though you don't really mind the chill. The silence feels full, not empty but humming with echoes of deals struck and stories told. You can almost hear them, voices trading recipes as easily as rumors. One trader brags about his pomegranate ferment, another boasts of barley stronger than water, another whispers of a smoked cheese drink from the north that cures sadness. You laugh softly, humanity's faith in beverages as therapy hasn't changed much. You stop beside a crumbling wall where faint murals remain, a procession of figures carrying jars and bowls, painted in ochre and black. One figure stands apart, arm extended, offering a cup to another wearing foreign attire. It's a transaction, frozen mid-offer. The expression on both faces is unmistakable, anticipation. You realize that moment, two strangers sharing fermented drink, might have been the spark of peace more often than any treaty. The quirky edges of history creep in again. Some scholars think that trade festivals doubled as matchmaking events between city-states, where fermented goods lubricated both diplomacy and romance. Picture it, ambassadors slightly tipsy, suddenly finding each other much more agreeable. You chuckle. Maybe the first international agreement was signed under the influence of really good beer. The road begins to climb again, winding toward a rocky ridge. You pause halfway up and look back over the valley. In your mind's eye, it comes alive, hundreds of travelers gathered around fires, the glow of torches on amphorae, laughter spilling like light. Somewhere, a storyteller raises his voice, recounting how the Hittites once traded not just metals but liquid life. You find a smooth stone and sit. The air is crisp, the stars impossibly bright. You take a slow breath and imagine the taste of those ancient drinks, sweet, sour, smoky, raw. You imagine the warmth spreading through you, softening everything sharp. It's not nostalgia, it's continuity. Historians still argue whether the Hittite trade routes were the first to spread fermentation culture westward or merely one conduit among many. But standing here, you sense the answer doesn't matter. What matters is that the world began to taste itself, to discover joy in transformation, in waiting, in sharing. You pick up a pebble and roll it between your fingers, its surface smooth from centuries of travelers' feet. It feels like time itself, shaped by countless small movements. You place it back gently, like returning a coin to an old friend's hand. The night is still, except for the faint hum of wind through ruins. You whisper, half to yourself, trade routes of taste. It sounds poetic, but you realize it's literal. Every civilization since has been fermenting ideas the same way, mixing, waiting, transforming. And as you stand to leave, the valley glows faintly under the moon. For a moment, it looks like a map of veins, pulsing softly, as if the earth itself remembers every route where flavor once traveled. The ridge narrows as you climb, the valley shrinking into shadow behind you. The air grows thinner, the wind more insistent, tugging at your sleeves like a reminder that nothing, no civilization, no flavor, no craft, stays forever. You reach a plateau and pause, looking out over the quiet sprawl of what was once the Hittite capital's outer fields. Nothing moves. The silence feels deliberate, like the world itself has pressed pause. You step forward, boots crunching over scattered potsherds. Some are glazed faintly red, others blackened with soot. You recognize the shapes instantly. Fermentation jars, storage vessels, the kind that once breathed with slow, living bubbles. Now they are dry, cracked, empty. A whole culture of microbes and makers gone still. The mainstream historical fact settles in your mind like dust. Around the 12th century BCE, the Hittite Empire collapsed. No single cause, just a slow, tangled unraveling of war, drought, rebellion, and shifting trade routes. In that vacuum, languages vanished, gods lost their names, and ordinary practices like fermentation, too small to inscribe on monuments, faded with their keepers. You crouch by a broken amphora and see the faint ring of residue inside, a ghostly stain of once fermenting grain. You run your finger over it. It's powder now, lifeless, though the smell, strangely enough, still hints at sweetness. You inhale and can almost taste memory itself. Historians still argue whether the collapse came fast or slow. Some say a generation, others a century. Either way, The effect was the same. Songs stopped being sung, recipes stopped being copied, and the art of the invisible was swallowed by silence. You can almost hear that silence now, an aching quiet between breaths. A quirky tidbit drifts in. When the first Iron Age settlers arrived generations later, they found buried jars still sealed with resin. A few even opened them. What they tasted was described in one account as sweet as death, thick as grief. You smirk sadly. Leave it to history to turn fermentation into metaphor. You wander deeper among the ruins, passing the remains of storage rooms and cracked kilns. The walls lean inward, as if bowing to time. The air tastes dry, no hint of yeast, no promise of bubbling life. You imagine the last Hittite brewer standing here, staring at his jars, realizing no one will inherit them. Maybe he seals one for good measure, muttering, "Let the gods finish what we began." Then he leaves, and the desert begins its slow feast. You step into a room where the floor is laid with fragments of clay tablets. You kneel and pick one up. It's worn smooth, the symbols half erased. You can still make out the sign for grain, and, faintly beside it, something that looks like song. It's fitting. The recipe and the hymn were probably one and the same. Historians still argue whether any Hittite fermentation text survived translation into later Anatolian tongues. A few fragments appear in Neo-Hittite archives, references to beer of the old kings, or bread that speaks to the fire. But the process, the daily touch, the timing, the taste, those things die quietly, like a candle under glass. You find yourself whispering as you walk, not sure why. Maybe to fill the void. "Where did you go?" you ask the air. The wind answers with a dry hiss through the reeds. You smile faintly. Of course. Fermentation's greatest enemy, desiccation. Without moisture, nothing can live, not even memory. You pass what might have been a granary. Its floor is lined with hardened mud, and the ceiling long collapsed. In the corner, you spot something odd, a patch of darker soil, circular, shallow. You crouch and dig with your hands. Beneath the dust lies a buried bowl, intact, still sealed with clay. You brush it off carefully, heart fluttering. For a moment, you wonder, could this be one of those unbroken jars the legends mention? You crack the edge gently. A faint hiss escapes, soft as a sigh. The smell that follows is indescribable, earthy, sweet, sour, faintly floral. You close your eyes, and for one impossible heartbeat, the air around you feels alive again. The past exhales. You set the jar down carefully. It feels like holding the last heartbeat of a civilization. Maybe it's symbolic, maybe literal, you can't tell anymore. What matters is that it's still here, still speaking in scent instead of words. Historians still argue whether modern Anatolian fermentation traditions, like Boza or Aaron, carry traces of Hittite methods. Some swear by continuity, others by coincidence. But smelling that jar, you're certain of one thing: flavor doesn't vanish. It migrates, adapts, hides in other kitchens, other hands. You stand slowly, taking in the desolation. The landscape glows faintly under the moon, the broken stones like scattered teeth. Yet, amid the ruin, life goes on, tiny lizards darting between cracks, grasses curling through pottery, microbes still stirring unseen beneath the surface. Even decay, it seems, refuses to stay dead. You walk toward the edge of the plateau, where the view stretches endlessly. The wind has picked up, warm now, carrying the scent of earth after centuries of cold. You close your eyes and imagine the city alive again, fires burning, jars bubbling, laughter echoing through courtyards. It's all still there, faint but not gone, like flavor clinging to a spoon. You open your eyes and whisper, "When silence fermented." The words feel heavy, right? Because silence does ferment. It changes shape, gains depth, becomes memory. The Hittites' silence did too. It fermented into myth, into archaeology, into the soft curiosity that led you here. You take one last breath, letting the ghost scent of that ancient jar fill your lungs. Somewhere between sweetness and rot, you taste resilience. You descend from the plateau slowly, each step muffled by dust and time. The air is warmer here, heavier, as though it too remembers the countless fires that once flickered beneath these hills. You follow a narrow path that curls into a small hollow surrounded by stone. It's quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat, or maybe that's the low hum of wind weaving through the rocks like a sigh. Then, ahead of you, it appears, half buried in the slope, shaped like a patient waiting for its turn in the story. An enormous clay vessel, unbroken, its mouth sealed with hardened resin and bound in faded rope. The surface is etched with faint spirals and what might be fingerprints pressed into wet clay thousands of years ago. You crouch beside it, brushing the dust from its shoulder. The air carries a faint sweetness, almost floral, seeping through a tiny crack in the seal. This is it. The last jar. The final breath of a forgotten craft. The mainstream historical fact comes easily. Archaeologists have unearthed sealed Hittite storage jars, some still containing traces of fermenting residue, yeast, honey, even ancient hop-like herbs. These remnants allow scientists to recreate, in part, what once filled them. But as you run your hand along the vessel's side, you understand something no lab can measure. This jar isn't just an artifact. It's a heartbeat caught mid-pulse. You lean closer, pressing your ear against it. There's no sound, of course, but you want to hear it, to imagine the soft hiss of gases, the gentle pop of bubbles rising through thick sweetness. You whisper, "Are you still there?" For a second, you think you catch a faint echo, not through your ears but your chest, a sensation more than sound. Maybe it's just your own breath rebounding in clay. Or maybe, historians still argue whether these jars were sealed intentionally to preserve sacred brews or simply abandoned mid-process during the empire's fall. Some claim they were offerings, liquid prayers entombed for gods who never answered. Others think they were just misplaced during panic. The debate continues, but as you sit beside this one, the theory doesn't matter. The feeling does. You rest your palm flat on the vessel's warm flank. Beneath it lies the slow fermentation of memory, centuries of patience, waiting for someone, anyone, to listen again. You find yourself thinking of all the people who once tended it. The brewer humming by firelight, the priest blessing the first froth, the farmer carrying barley from his field, hoping the gods would favor his yield. All of them poured something of themselves in here. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some later Anatolian legends tell of jars that whisper, said to contain the voices of ancestors. When opened, they supposedly released songs, scents, or memories. You smile. Maybe that myth was born from discoveries just like this. Someone finding an ancient vessel, prying it open, and catching that fleeting, intoxicating scent of the past. You lean closer again. The crack in the seal glimmers faintly, a dark amber sheen where resin melted long ago. The smell deepens, honey, wild herbs, perhaps the faint tang of fermented grain. You breathe it in slowly. It's both alien and familiar, like déjà vu for your senses. You realize you're inhaling the same air molecules that escaped from this jar thousands of years ago. The same scent that drifted through a Hittite temple, a Hittite kitchen, a Hittite dream. Historians still argue whether smell can truly survive millennia, but your nose disagrees. You're proof it can. Memory rides scent more faithfully than language. You can almost see them now, women stirring pots, men hauling amphorae, laughter spilling over the clatter of tools. You feel as if you've stepped into the inhale of history itself. You sit back, cross-legged, and just breathe for a while. The wind has softened, the stars blink low, and the ruins behind you seem to listen too. Everything feels suspended, fermenting in silence. You smile faintly. This, you realize, is what the Hittites knew, that life, death, decay, and rebirth all share the same process. Everything ferments. It just takes time. You close your eyes and imagine breaking the seal. The sound would be tiny, a soft crack, and then the scent would pour out, a flood of sweetness and earth. Maybe it would be glorious. Maybe it would be poison. You'll never know, and that's somehow perfect. Some secrets taste better untasted. The night deepens, wrapping around you like the cool belly of the earth. You let yourself sink into it, feeling the hum of history slowing, softening, settling. The forgotten fermentation methods of the Hittites aren't truly forgotten. They're just sleeping, waiting for curious hands and open minds to wake them again. Now, the wind stirs, warm as breath. The stars overhead blur slightly as fatigue creeps in, heavy and gentle. You exhale, slow and steady, as though matching the rhythm of the unseen bubbles beneath that ancient seal. And as you rest your head against the jar, you think, maybe every story is a kind of fermentation too. Words and wonder, sealed in time, waiting to be opened. You smile, eyes half-lidded, and let the past finish its work. The night softens further, the valley dissolving into mist. The stars blur, and the ruins no longer look like ruins. They look like the ribs of something asleep, breathing slow beneath the earth. The air tastes warm, sweet, faintly sour. Somewhere, an owl calls once, then drifts into silence. You lean back, tracing one more circle on the jar's cool surface. It feels alive again, as though time has stopped holding its breath. The ground beneath you hums with a low vibration, maybe wind, maybe memory. You let it roll through you, unhurried, dissolving the edges of thought. Your heartbeat matches the rhythm of the unseen bubbles that once rose here. You imagine them still rising, invisible and endless, carrying whispers of barley and honey into the air. Every exhale feels older, slower. The ruins blur into darkness, and darkness becomes comfort. If the Hittites could see you now, they might laugh softly, another wanderer, another listener, lulled to drowsiness by jars and ghosts. But that's the beauty of it, even their silence still teaches. It tells you that transformation never truly ends. It only slows, rests, waits. So you stay there, letting the air cool around your skin, letting each breath stretch a little longer than the last. The night folds in, gentle as cloth. You whisper one last thought, not quite a prayer, not quite a promise. Sleep well, old bros. Your work isn't forgotten. And as the words drift away, so do you, sinking softly into the quiet ferment of dreams.